Hello, and welcome to the Justin Center podcast. I am your host, Dr. Jordan Cooper. Thank you so much for joining me once again on the program today. Just a quick reminder that this organization that we run, Justin Center, is donor supported. And we would ask you to consider becoming a contributor. Go to justincenter.org and go to the donate page. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization, so your gifts are tax deductible. And we're just going to jump right into the topic of the program today. I have a guest with me. I have with me Dr. Matthew Barrett, who is Associate Professor of Christian Theology at Midwestern Baptist Seminary. He also is the author of a number of books, including one that we're going to be talking about today called Simply Trinity, the Unmanipulated Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. He also runs Credo, which is a magazine and a podcast as well that you may want to check out if you're interested in these topics. So, Dr. Barrett, thank you so much for coming on.
Hey, thanks for having me and to talk about something as important as the doctrine of the Trinity.
Yeah, so I'm really excited that, that you're putting out this work, that there are so many people kind of going back to doctrine of God issues. And I recently had a discussion with Craig Carter on his book, and I know yours was released around the same time. And I think I read them within the same week, and I feel like they were very good supplements to one another. So this is, go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's really encouraging to hear. Craig and I are good friends. We didn't plan on that, though. It just sort of happened that our books released around the same time. But I'm encouraged because I've heard that from other people as well, that Craig's obviously trying to argue his case and I'm trying to argue mine, but as it turns out, we're actually arguing for pretty much the same thing. And we're hitting different audiences as we do it. So that's really encouraging.
Yeah, that's great. I think the only downside to that is when I was speaking with him, there were a couple times where I almost mentioned something that was in your book and asked him what he thought about it, thinking it was his, and then I had to realize, oh, wait a minute, that's
yeah, I could see how that could happen. He would have forgave you, I think.
Okay, well, that's good. Yeah, so obviously we're coming from different traditions. So I'm from the Lutheran tradition, and you're Baptist, kind of in the evangelical world, and but it does seem like we're all kind of facing very similar issues coming out of specifically the 20th century and just where theology went in the 20th century. In my own kind of theological background, I guess, I first encountered what we call social Trinitarianism, is what we'll get into what that means, through the writings of people like Jürgen Moltmann and Wolfhard Pannenberg, who were kind of connected to the Lutheran tradition, but definitely further left, I think, than the part of it that I'm a part of. But we really saw a lot of little pieces of that kind of, I think, come over into the more maybe confessional tradition as well. And it seems like a similar thing happened in the Reformed world. So why don't we start with just talking about what social Trinitarianism is, and then talk about how that kind of came into evangelicalism.
Well, that's the $1 million question, isn't it? How in the world did it make its way into evangelicalism? I've got all kinds of speculations, some that are a bit more cultural, some that are a bit more theological. I'll just start off by saying this. I'm on the one hand, when we look at social Trinitarianism, we immediately think of a figure like Jürgen Moltmann.
Right.
Though you mentioned Pannenberg as well, and that's really astute. It's so interesting. You might enjoy this little tidbit. When I teach my systematic class and my systematic students, we often will go to Moltmann as a bit of a foil for any variety of issues, to see the contrast between, say, the fathers and then kind of after modernity. So we might do this on the atonement or impassibility or any range of issues. But I have to always tell my students, if you haven't taken church history yet, please don't assume that this is just Lutheranism.
Well, thank you for that. I do appreciate this.
because I started to sense that from some who didn't know any better, and I thought, oh no. So then to sort of clarify things, just recently actually, I brought in Luther himself and said, okay, let's take a look at Luther. I don't want you to think that Lutheranism is just synonymous with Moltmann or someone else. But all that to say, yes, you're right. When we look at the 20th century in particular, we begin to see a shift towards social Trinitarianism. Now, what exactly social Trinitarianism is? Well, we could contrast it with the patristic view of the Trinity, or what I would call just a classical Nicene view of the Trinity. When we go back and look at the pro-Nicene tradition, they weren't fearful of, say, metaphysics. In fact, they very much welcome metaphysics, not over against the text of Scripture, but to understand what Scripture was saying better, and even to safeguard what Scripture says. And so you think, for example, of the Nicene Creed. And they started using this language of divine simplicity to preserve the unity of the three persons as one in essence, and then simultaneously using language to distinguish the persons according to what they called their eternal relations of origin. And so they would, and this is very much building off of the biblical material, they would use a certain vocabulary to do this. The Son is begotten from the Father, but because this is the eternal Son we are talking about, there never was a time when the Son was not. And so the Son is eternally begotten from the Father's essence. And of course, assumed in that type of a statement is that the Father is unbegotten. And this is what it means for the Father to be Father and the Son to be Son. And likewise, when the Spirit was attacked in different ways, they also were sure to define and distinguish the Spirit as the one who eternally proceeds, or is spirated, we could say, from the Father and the Son. And they looked especially to Gospels like John's Gospel, in order to substantiate this vocabulary and these very concepts. And as this became articulated into the late patristic and medieval period, you think of Anselm and his work on the Spirit, or Thomas Aquinas and the helpful language he introduces, they started to speak of these persons as subsisting relations. And the reason they did that in part was not just to distinguish Father, Son, Spirit, but to also safeguard the equality and the common nature of the three persons. And they would even use language like the essence has three modes of subsistence. And then they would go on to talk about what does it mean to be Father? What does it mean to be Son? What does it mean to be Spirit? That sort of thing. Even if we go back to, say, the 4th century, we see the church sort of pregnant, if I can use that word, pregnant with these very concepts, in the way that so many of the fathers are adamant that yes, say, take eternal generation, for example. Yes, eternal generation distinguishes the Son as Son. That's why we call him Son.
Right. And
yet at the same time, eternal generation also safeguards the equality because he's the Son begotten from the Father's essence. Well, what in the world does any of this have to do with social Trinitarianism in the 20th century? When you get to the 20th century, there is a clear modification, and in some cases, it's just a clear departure from all of this metaphysical preoccupation. And there's a lot to say as to why and how, what that looks like. I think at the bare minimum, we could say there's not so much of a concern anymore to define the unity of the Trinity in terms of divine simplicity, for example, but there's more of an emphasis on the persons as certain relationships, more in the modern sense of that term. And then in terms of the Trinity as a whole, the focus shifts to societal categories. So trying to define the Trinity as a community or as a society in which there is this mutuality of love or even cooperation. Some social Trinitarians have gone so far as to say that the persons are their own individuals, their own agents, their own centers of consciousness and will. And they've even used concepts like perichoresis, but redefined it in more of this social mindset. And as a result of that, they've, though there's a large spectrum of social Trinitarians, and they do differ from each other at times, they've been to one degree or another quite critical of certain aspects or the Nicene tradition as a whole, and they've moved more in this direction of a social trinity. And from there, they've also then made a very direct connection to very direct flight, if we can put it that way, to use then this social redefinition of the Trinity for any variety of social agendas.
Right.
Moltmann is a case of this, in which and he's very honest about it, which actually I appreciate. He's very honest, in which he says we must redefine the Trinity in these social categories, and by doing so, this type of Trinity now becomes our social program. In his case, he's very adamant for politics, but for others, it could be for gender discussions, it could be for ecology, it could be for religious pluralism. The list really is bottomless.
Yeah, I think it's interesting how much, when you're talking about social Trinitarianism and these various agendas, it happens on both the left and the right. I mean, in some ways, they're kind of mirrors of each other, where you have the left saying this is, even getting into like defenses of homosexual love as relating to father and son. But then you have kind of the opposite end of the spectrum, which is this idea of this eternal subordination of the Son, when you have, well, male-female gender distinctions that are there in creation are a reflection of something that's eternal. So it's kind of like both sides are guilty of the same basic error. So it's not just a problem on the left or on the right. This is a problem that kind of is much broader than that.
You're exactly right. And as I was writing my book, Simply Trinity, that's one of the shocking, I mean, I had known it for years now, but when I was forced to sit down and actually trace out some of the history, it was a bit discouraging at times, because you start to realize, wait a minute, this is, as much as we might like to think, oh, this is something out there, especially as, conservatives, we theological conservatives, we might like to point the finger and say, oh, that's a modern problem.
Right.
Thank God that's not us. But actually, when you look at the literature on the Trinity by evangelicals across different denominations, you begin to realize, wait a minute, we actually have been very influenced by modernity. For some, it's this subtle redefinition of the Trinity that takes place, in which we start to define the Trinity in a way that's really quite just analogous to our human society. Mm-hmm. Our assumptions about what a human person is somehow get projected into what a divine person is. But you're right, in some cases, it even goes further, in which now this social redefinition of the Trinity becomes it becomes our social program, to use some of the language of Miroslav Volf. Becomes a social program, in fact, even for something like gender.
Yeah, absolutely. So it ends up doing this all over the place. In this, to kind of understand what's going on, I think it's important to trace things back to the 19th century, where we had an era where, theological liberals basically just threw out the Trinity altogether. If you look at Schleiermacher, like, it's got no real practical function, and Ritschl does something similar with it. But once you get into the 20th century, and I think you dealt with this really well, is that people refer to this as like a revival of Trinitarianism. And then there is, in some way, people are trying to kind of rediscover the Trinity, which is so key to Christianity. But that rediscovery ends up being not so much really a rediscovery as it is a reformulation.
Yeah, and this is where some of the rhetoric, I think, has been confusing. There's been this idea that, oh, the 20th century is a renaissance.
Right.
It's a renaissance of Trinitarian thought. And to which I say, well, what do you mean exactly? If you just mean there's a renewed interest and an incredible amount of publications from Barth to Karl Rahner and many others, okay, fine. But I think more and more historians like Lewis Ayres, for example, theologians like Stephen Holmes, and many others have been raising the question, well, what kind of Renaissance is this? What kind of Trinity actually are we claiming we are reviving? Mm-hmm. And as it turns out, across the board, many have said it's not quite a Nicene doctrine of the Trinity that the church confess in its creeds and its confessions and catechisms. Instead, it's actually a redefinition of the Trinity in societal categories that doesn't look all that different from how we define one another. And right. I think you see this especially when you look at the way the Trinity or the persons of the Trinity are defined. If you ask, well, if you ask, 20th century theologians, what is it that constitutes the unity of right. these persons? Oftentimes it's something functional. It's something like a type of cooperation between the persons. That would have been really foreign to the Nicene tradition, which understood that actually it's something very specific. It's when we talk about the persons, the unity has everything to do with divine simplicity itself. And so it's no wonder then, both in modern circles and especially in evangelical circles, that something like divine simplicity has really fallen on hard times.
Right. So, I mean, the main problem here, right, is that it leans towards what we may think of as like a tritheism, right? And that's really the concern is the unity of the Godhead with classical doctrines like divine simplicity. There's a project that I'm currently working on, and I'm looking at this particular Mormon philosopher named Blake Ostler. I don't know if you've encountered him at all, but what's so interesting is in his work, he's gone back to Moltmann and a lot of social Trinitarians in the 20th century, and he's making the essential argument that, well, the Mormon doctrine of God can actually be Trinitarian if we understand it in the way that these social Trinitarians have defined the Trinity. And I find that is so interesting because, of course, from a Mormon perspective, they believe in three separate personages. There are three separate gods. But someone from that perspective is understanding, hey, the implications of this are tritheism. And for them, that's a good thing. But of course, most Christians who are social Trinitarians in one degree or another, they're not claiming to be tritheists, of course no. Not. But why is it that, or what's the problem with that? Like, what's the problem with getting into tritheism? Why is that such a bad thing?
Well, you make a really important observation because I think it would be a bit shocking and surprising, but I think there's truth to it that decades from now, I think theologians will look back and say, well, what was the Trinitarian temptation of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century? I think they might say it was a bit of a slide into tritheism. And you're right. On the one hand, no one's going to come out and say, oh, I'm a tritheist.
Right.
That doesn't typically happen. But at the same time, we have to realize we can often slip into something close to it, if not tritheism itself, in the way that we are actually defining the Trinity. So just to give one example of this, when we begin defining the persons as distinct and even separate centers of consciousness, or even as persons who have their own will, Even evangelical philosophers have gone, some evangelical philosophers have gone this route recently. And then it raises the question of there being not one, but three wills in the Trinity. Well, or maybe it's more subtle than that, right? Maybe we are defining the persons or the Trinity as a whole, not in terms of, say, the Son begotten from the Father's very essence, but rather in terms of, say, the Son being functionally subordinate to the Father, or in terms of the Father having authority as the primary thing that defines him as Father. As soon as we start going in any number of those directions, we begin to slip into a type of something close to a type of tritheism, because notice that may be true for how we interact with each other as human persons. We have our own will. You have your own will, I have my own will. We might cooperate or collaborate. If we're going about a project, we might even divvy up the labor. And so we might define unity in that very basic sense, but at the end of the day, we remain our own individuals. If we're not careful, if we apply that or project that onto Trinitarian persons, what do we end up with? Well, we end up with a type of Trinity in which the persons are separate from one another. I think at the end of the day, we see this most of all in the way that a doctrine like inseparable operations seems to just vanish from our Trinitarian vocabulary.
Yeah, and I love that you have a whole chapter on that, because that's just not a topic that is ever really a topic of conversation. I think to most pastors, who've gone through a seminary program at nearly any school, if you bring up the concept of inseparable operations and ask them to explain it, they probably can't. Like it's not something that really has been a theme in our theology. So why don't you just give us a definition as you're bringing this up, and then I do want to get to eternal generation too, because I think that's really, really key for all these debates. But yeah, define for us, what do you mean by inseparable operations?
Yeah, to put it very roughly, when we talk about the Trinity, it's very crucial to say that the persons of the Trinity have one will in common. And the reason for that is because they have one essence in common. And so we don't take this idea of will and sort of tie it to person in such a way that we end up with three wills. That would tempt tritheism, but rather we recognize that, yes, Father is distinct as unbegotten, the Son is distinct as begotten, and the Spirit is spirated, but they are subsistences of the same divine essence. They hold the one divine essence and will in common. And because of that, we can say there's one essence, one will, one glory, one power in the Trinity. Now, when we then move from who God is in and of himself to then what we call the economy of salvation, for example, when we move towards the economy and to use our own, just very practical language, how this triune God acts in the world, well, when we make that move, how do we do it? Do we start to speak of the persons as if they can go solo? Some evangelicals have gone this route in which they start saying things like the Father doesn't need the Son. He can and sometimes does act exclusively without the Son.
When I encountered that in your book, I was actually pretty shocked by some of those statements. I don't think I had ever encountered anything so blunt.
It is shocking. You're absolutely right. And what's the problem there? Well, we're violating something called inseparable operations, which basically means, Augustine put it this way, that the reason the Trinity acts as one is because the Trinity is one. In other words,
Right.
in the external works of the Trinity, Father, Son, and Spirit, they don't go off and perform their own individual actions by their own individual wills. They perform one and the single same action according to their singularity of essence. Now, there's obviously a lot more to explain as to what that looks like and so on. But at the very foundational level, this belief was considered absolutely essential. In fact, Lewis Ayres, in his book on Nicaea, interestingly enough, he actually lists inseparable operations and says that this was an essential component in order to even be considered orthodox. Ironically, in our own day, I don't know that that is the case anymore. We have lost this idea of the unity of God, both in his being and in the singular work that Father, Son, and Spirit perform, if we can put it that way. And by consequence, we start, going back to your point, we start to sound a bit like tritheists when we describe creation, providence, or even salvation itself. I think we especially see it when we describe salvation.
Yeah, and you also, as you bring up the economy, I feel like we've got to touch on Rahner's rule too, because that's so key. I mean, that's like it seems like the definitive theological claim of the 20th century in some ways. So let's explain, what is Rahner's rule, and then what's wrong with it?
Yes, well, when we look at the 20th century and ask the question, where do things start changing? Where is there a shift? There's been a lot of discussion over Rahner's rule. Essentially, Karl Rahner said that the immanent Trinity is the economic, and the economic is the immanent. And just a little definition here for those who are listening and watching. By immanent, we typically are referring to God in and of himself, and by economic, like we were just talking about, we are referring to God's external works in the world. Well, there's all kinds of debate and discussion over what exactly did Rahner mean. And some have wanted to be more generous towards him. Others have said, no, he really does think these are synonymous with each other. Regardless, though, one thing is clear. Those who picked up Rahner's rule used it in its most radical sense. So that you even get to certain individuals in the latter half of the 20th century. I think, for example, of someone like Robert Jensen.
Yes.
Who, on the one hand, he's a very profound thinker, but can even start using language like the economic, or he'll refer to something in the economic and say, this constitutes the immanent Trinity, which raises all kinds of squirrely questions. You take the Incarnation, for example. What are we saying at that point? Does something like eternal generation disappear? Or does that just get conflated with or confused with Jesus and his incarnation in history? And those questions start to come to the front. Well, I think there's good reasons why these questions get raised, because if we conflate, as I call it, who God is in and of himself with whatever we see God do for the purpose of creation or salvation, we actually reduce the God of eternity to our little box of history, as I call it. And at that point, anything could go. You might throw out eternal relations of origin altogether. In its most radical forms, you might even start saying things like Jesus is not the Son of God until he's incarnate. But even in more subtle forms, you begin to think, and this is really where my book goes with it, you begin to just assume that whatever we see, say, for example, in the Incarnation, we just assume, oh, that just must be true then of who God is apart from creation,
Right.
apart from the Incarnation. And we don't carefully distinguish between, say, human nature, divine nature in the Incarnation. And we begin to start projecting just about anything and everything back onto God. I think Moltmann makes this mistake, to be very honest, when it comes to suffering and impassibility, in which he will look at the Incarnation, see the suffering that takes place in the Incarnation, becomes very critical of Nicaea and Chalcedon, and then starts speaking of God in a way that completely rejects, say, divine immutability or impassibility, and starts speaking of the suffering God in a way that I think would make it would make Luther blush.
Oh yeah, for sure, for sure. I'm glad you
We
bring
can do that with all kinds of things. It's not just something like suffering. We can do that with subordination, for example, and this really becomes endless.
Yeah, I'm glad you bring up Robert Jensen there as well. I think Jensen is such a good example of kind of the most extreme form of Rahner's rule. In that, you find this in Pannenberg as well, that especially when they're talking about the Son, Jesus' deity is in some way founded upon his resurrection.
Yeah, that is a shocking statement, isn't it?
It certainly is.
It really is. And on the one hand, it can sound so appealing, because you think, for example, of someone like Hans Frey, who's, on the one hand, there's maybe a good motive here. He wants to really take us back to the biblical narrative, to the cross, to the resurrection, like you just pointed out. But then he might go so far to say, that's it. That's only our focus. We have to just limit ourselves to to narrative. Well, when you do that, all of a sudden, you now define God according to the human nature of Jesus,
right?
And that then automatically then rules out categories and entire doctrines that relate to God apart from the world, even apart from salvation. I think on a very practical church level, we see this happen all the time, and we're very prone to it, in part because we have this good emphasis on the gospel, this good emphasis on being Christ-centered, this good emphasis on focusing on the narratives, right? Those are all good things. However, we can just assume for all kinds of reasons that that's it. And we don't pay attention to, say, John, for example, who says, well, yeah, we're going to talk about the gospel. We're going to talk about the Incarnation. We're going to talk about history. But why is that we can even talk about this? And he starts off with, in John 1, by laying down some metaphysics and saying, who is this word? Before we get to talk about what it means for the Son to come into the world, who is this Son who's from eternity? So we don't have to be afraid of metaphysics. In fact, I argue in my book that if we don't have it, then we actually don't have a foundation on which to put the gospel itself, which is a scary thought.
Yeah, absolutely. I think John's prologue is just so key to this, because it so flies in the face of the kind of reasoning that you would expect had he the same kind of perspective of someone like Robert Jensen. I mean, Jensen even makes the argument, he's got a little article where he argues that there is no logos asarkos, so there is no logos apart from the flesh, which I don't know how you read John's prologue and come to that conclusion. The text the reasoning of the text seems to kind of fly in the face of that. It doesn't really fit. And one of the things that I really want to spend some time on, two things really. One is eternal generation, and then I want to get to this discussion of the subordination of the Son, because I think it's so important in our current context, because it's become very prominent. I think it's probably less prominent since the issue has been raised. But Let's start with generation, because eternal generation seems like it's one of those doctrines that was really essential to Nicaea. And at least as far back as Origen, you find it being really central to understanding who the Son is in eternity. But throughout the 20th century, you see not just, and this is again, not just, the kind of progressive liberal, scholars or something. Like we're talking about evangelical theologians and exegetes who start to say maybe this whole idea of generation isn't biblical, having to do with the interpretation of monogenes. And for example, I heard one prominent Van Tillian theologian give a lecture on this, and he basically says, well, the whole idea of eternal generation in its historic form is any kind of derivation of essence. He says, well, that really all comes from Aquinas. And that's not really what, so you get from all different
and we know Aquinas can't be right.
Well, that's the underlying assumption, right? Is like Aquinas is the bad guy.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah,
Just mention Aquinas and it's wrong.
yeah, exactly. For certain people, that does tend to be the assumption. So what's going on with eternal generation within, say, evangelicalism? I think you have a really good discussion of that and the monogenes debate. So what's this all about?
Well, goodness, it is a big discussion.
Yeah.
I think in the last 10 years or so, evangelicalism, its weak point or Achilles heel has really been exposed. On the one hand, we see in the 90s and then the 2000s, just a more and more just a common rejection of the doctrine of eternal generation. Sometimes it's said that, well, this is for exegetical reasons. Other times it's said it's for doctrinal reasons, like you just mentioned. What's so fascinating, though, is when you look at the reasons that are given, you take like Wayne Grudem, for example, and for decades, Grudem rejected eternal generation and took issue with the Nicene Creed. And a lot of it came back to monogenes, in which he did this word study and said, I don't think it actually supports this idea of begetting. And you see this then follow with, or I should say it's really simultaneous in translations of the Bible. Very popular translations of the Bible, all kinds of translations. It's not just limited to one, in which the language that was just very much of the past and just accepted of, think of John 3:16, right? A passage that most people probably know, even from the King James Version, in which it mentions Jesus as the only begotten Son. All of a sudden, this language just disappears. And at best, it refers to the unique Son or the only Son, that type of language instead. What's happened since? Well, a couple things. One thing actually beyond these debates is that there's been some discontent, and I think appropriate discontent, with the methods we are using. And I think it's right that many have said, why are we throwing out a doctrine that is so basic to Christian orthodoxy, so essential to our creeds, and to even making sense of the Bible? Why are we throwing this out because we may or may not agree with a particular word study? When we go back and we look at the best exegetes of the past, we'll notice that actually their case for eternal generation was far more colorful, far more diverse and robust. And so in my book, Simply Trinity, I devote an entire chapter to showing what I call the mosaic of eternal generation. And we look at the word study, but we go way beyond that. And we look at the context in a gospel like John 5, for example. Why is it that Jesus is using language to say that just as the Father has life in himself, so he has granted the Son to have life in himself? And
that's such a key text.
Yeah, and we look at the context to say what it seems as if the religious leaders understand just how offensive this is if Jesus really means what he says about his eternal origin. And then we look at a diversity of this mosaic across the canon. So, for example, we look at the language of radiance in the book of Hebrews, Hebrews chapter 1. Why is it that Hebrews speaks of the Son as the radiance of the glory of God? And why is he also then uh, going back to the Old Testament later in Hebrews 1 to introduce this idea of begetting as well? He seems to be very comfortable moving between different metaphors to capture the eternal origin of the Son. And then I look at countless other images as well. For example, I go to Paul and we look at his use of image. Why is it that Paul describes Jesus as the image of the invisible God? He seems to be conveying something not all that different from John or Jesus, or the idea of wisdom, for example. Why is it that Proverbs 8 seems to get picked up by Paul when he's writing to the Corinthians?
Right.
And applied to Jesus as the wisdom of God? Well, this very concept of wisdom seems to, in the context of Proverbs, seems to go back and actually locate Jesus within deity itself. And so we go on and on from there. We even, towards the end, get into the label Ancient of Days, one of my favorites, in which we look at the book of Micah chapter 5, and then turn to see how this is used of Jesus in Matthew 2. I could go on. The point I'm trying to make is when we actually take time to look at this beautiful mosaic, what we discover is that, eternal generation, this idea, this concept, it's not limited to some like random proof text. It actually pervades the canon of Scripture, and all these different metaphors and concepts and images get picked up for good reason by the fathers, so that they can then flesh out its theological logic. And that's where I go in the other chapter, is I spend an entire chapter actually trying to define eternal generation and really explain the logic behind it and why it's so key, not only to distinguishing the Son, but also safeguarding his equality with the Father.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, it's so key to see that, and I see this with a lot of doctrines, is oftentimes people want to kind of found these ideas on one proof text.
Yeah.
When if you go back in church history and just read the richest of the theological conversation around these things, there's far more than just, it depends on one particular text, and that's it.
Right. That's so right. And so this is one of the reasons why I say throughout the book, if we're going to do better in the future, we have to rid ourselves of this type of crude, narrow biblicism,
right,
that you're describing. And we have to start reading the Bible more holistically and even theologically. And that's where I think so much of the past, both the fathers, patristic medieval, as well as some of the after the Reformation, some of the scholastics, this is where they can really help us. Is they seem to go about their exegesis in a way that's far more healthy.
Yeah, absolutely. If anyone doesn't want to read more on this, I know you cite Lee Iron's really great article. That was a very eye-opening article when I first read that. If you want to get into this conversation, I know that's available online. You can, maybe I'll put a link down below to that. That's a really excellent treatment of this subject. And he discusses even how some of Calvin's language at times can even differ from the classical Nicene view, and he doesn't say much about it, but they're little like hints that it's not quite where Nicaea was in some ways.
Yes, that's right. And your Charles, his article by Charles Lee Irons there is really fantastic. Those listening, they can find that in that book by Scott Swain and Fred Sanders, Retrieving Eternal Generation. But yeah, I think he's onto something there. One of the reasons why comes down to how we even define eternal generation. When we
Yes.
define it, and this is where I think some evangelicals have been very impatient, is they just operate from our human experience of what it means for a human father to generate a son. And of course, then when they transition to God, they just find it completely illogical. But actually, if we're a little bit more patient, because after all, the concepts and ideas and language and terms that we use are built within an analogical system, as Aquinas pointed out so long ago. So if we're a bit more patient, we realize, well, yes, it's trying, just like image or radiance, this concept of generation or begetting, it's trying to convey something true, but that doesn't mean that we then press it so hard that we are literalistic. That comes back to that narrow biblicism I was mentioning, and then we just conclude, oh, that's illogical, and throw it out. No, this is God, the infinite, eternal God we're talking about. So when we define eternal generation, yes, it says something true. It explains why we use that language, Father and Son. And at the same time, we're saying the Father communicates this divine essence and all its glory to the Son, but he does so from eternity. And so that's where in my book, I spend quite a bit of time. I call them the 9 marks of an unhealthy generation, where I just list one after one. It doesn't mean this. It doesn't mean this. It doesn't mean this. And we try to preclude anything like change or time or anything carnal like corruption. All of these things we have to eliminate from our human assumptions.
Yeah, and that's really like the Chalcedonian way of describing things, right? It's not this, it's not this, it's not this. So much with, I guess it's, apophatic in that, like, oftentimes when we're speaking about theological truths, we do have to define what it is by negation, by saying what it's not. And that ultimately is a good thing, because what that does is preserves the mystery of our faith, and the fact that, like, we don't totally grasp what it is to be eternally generated. Why would we? Why should we expect to totally understand that?
It's a great point. It's a really great point you're making. And this is where I love to point out to evangelicals. Don't you realize, like, don't you see that when you are discarding mystery and you're refusing to be patient and describe God by what he's not, because he is infinite and eternal after all, don't you see that actually you sound just like, say, the Socinians, or if we go back further, you sound just like some of those Arians or semi-Arians, who also objected to eternal generation and in the most radical way, and compromised the equality of Christ. Why? Because they could not fathom how this concept might actually be qualified to preserve the mystery of the Trinity. They had no patience with the mystery altogether.
Yeah, and I see that tendency in some evangelical analytic philosophers. I think in some ways, certain ones that I'm thinking of, who kind of level, especially with divine simplicity, kind of just level the charge. Well, that doesn't make sense. Yeah. And there isn't this desire for the mystery, which is a good thing. I think we should see that as a good thing, and ultimately that should lead us in a posture of worship, to see God as beyond us. We can't grasp him. We shouldn't be able to.
And so that's one reason why, even in my book, I mentioned this. I think the battle has to be fought on 2 different fronts. On the one hand, certainly the exegetical front, in which we are trying to demonstrate what so many of the fathers did before us. So much of this mosaic. But then the other front is a bit more theological and philosophical. And I think divine simplicity is very much on the line, in which, you're right, there are a lot of evangelical philosophers who not only look at eternal generation, but divine simplicity and say, oh, that's illogical. And they forget that there's a creator-creature distinction, and
Right.
if you remove divine simplicity, all of a sudden it is very difficult. It's very difficult to set the creator apart from the creature. And I would even go further and say it's very difficult to hold on to an orthodox understanding of the Trinity
Yep.
if you abandon divine simplicity, which is one of the reasons why I have a bit of that cheeky title, Simply Trinity.
Right. Yeah. No, I love the title because of that. I think it's great. Because divine simplicity is so essential to so much else. And I think that is a large part of the reason why things got so off track in the last century, is because we really didn't have much of an understanding of simplicity, or if it was discussed, it was just kind of passed over or explained as something like, well, God doesn't have body parts,
Yeah.
which is not really what we're talking about with simplicity. But I want to, as we're kind of coming toward the end here, I want to make sure that we touch on eternal subordination, because I think that section of your book was my favorite part of this whole book. I think that
Good.
I just, and I think it's worth the price of the book just to read that section. And there's been a lot written on the subject, but I think your chapter is the most kind of comprehensive, short, get at the heart of the matter treatment, I think, that I've seen.
Yeah.
So I really appreciated what you had to say in so many ways there. So let's say a few things. I mean, there's so much we could talk about. Of course, we could spend a whole other hour on that. But
Sure.
What do you think is kind of the key issue there? Like, if you're talking about this subordination of the Son, what if you can't even say if there's a key issue? Because I know there are many, and we've probably kind of skirted around some of them already.
Yeah. Oh goodness. Well, I would say there are a number of key issues, some of which are probably a bit more pertinent than others. I think the first one I'd have to put my finger on is this. When we look at those who are advocating for an eternal subordination of the Son, they will not admit this, and they will not like hearing this, but I think it is so apparent that they are operating out of a social definition of the Trinity.
Right.
When you look at the language they're using, it is very clear. They are wanting to define the persons in terms of a society or a community. That's very essential, because when they then define why the Father is Father and the Son is Son, well, for the longest time, they rejected the definition of Father and Son according to the Father is unbegotten and the Son is begotten. And they said, no, we need to look to social categories, or functional categories, as they call them, or roles of hierarchy, in which the Father's Father because he has ultimate or superior or supreme authority and even glory over the Son, who is subordinate in all those ways. Now, they are always very careful to say that, this is not ontological, it's functional, which is a category that I think they've invented. But they'll say, it's not ontological, so the Son is equal in essence, but nonetheless, he's subordinate or submissive in role. And to be very clear, they are not just describing the Incarnation here. They are actually describing God in and of himself. So these are person-defining roles, as they call them. Very recently, when pushback came, they qualified their position to say that, okay, we will now accept eternal generation. Two things should be observed. One is why they're accepting it. Individuals like Grudem, for example, are now accepting it because they're convinced by that word study, not necessarily because they've they've been convinced, or they're looking at or using the wide theological and even biblical case for eternal generation. So it's still a very biblicist mindset.
Yeah.
But what I think is even more telling is that even then, they are saying, okay, we will accept eternal generation, but guess what? This doesn't hurt our position. It actually supports it. And so now they are saying, well, subordination flows from, it's found within eternal generation.
Right.
And naturally, they have to then say, eternal relations of origin, these alone can't distinguish the persons. There has to be now this second category as well, of functional hierarchy, of authority and submission. So that being the case, as much as some have been relieved to think, oh, now they're accepting eternal generation, I think we need to not be so quick to think, oh, they've changed. Actually, they're now using, which I think is quite erroneous and quite it is a type of manipulation in which they are using a pro-Nicene category like eternal generation to now introduce and support and even buttress their subordination all the more. And in that sense, I think their position, while it seems like it took a step back towards orthodoxy, in another sense, it took 2 steps forward away from orthodoxy.
Right.
Because at the bare minimum, I think we can say, though they won't agree with this, I think we can say this is absolutely novel. Now, there's a lot we could talk about by way of critique, but I guess I just want to lay some of those things out there to say that when the Trinity is defined in this way, I think there's no question that this is a departure from what I would call biblical, Orthodox, and Nicene Trinitarianism. But I'll throw it back at you because there's a lot we could say by way of critique as well.
Yeah, and obviously we don't have much time left at this point, but maybe one of the critiques that I found really interesting that you laid out was the nature of Christ's humiliation, and the fact that eternal, if there is an eternal subordination, there is not really any humiliation. So maybe if you could just, we'll do that point, and we'll kind of point the listeners to the book to get the rest of it, but maybe unpack that part of the argument a little bit.
Yeah, I'm really glad you caught on to this. In fact, I've done a lot of interviews about the book and about this issue as well. And you may be one of the few who noted that this actually does redefine how we think about the incarnation, and I argue even the way we think about grace itself. So in my chapter, I say there's really a twofold issue here. One is more metaphysics itself. I argue that if the persons really are subsistences of the divine essence, as soon as you introduce something like subordination, even if you call it functional, within the immanent life of God, within the person of the Son, there's no way you can keep it out of the essence. The only way to do that is to create this artificial divide between ontological and functional. So I spent quite a bit of time showing that this is artificial. It won't work, and it does put in danger the essence itself. But that aside, I then turn to maybe a discussion that is a bit closer to home in terms of just even how lay people and pastors understand the incarnation. And I make the point there that if this humility that we're seeing in the incarnation, which, by the way, I think that's a much better word, is far more Pauline than subordinate or submission.
Yeah.
If this humility is the case, in which we learn from Paul and Hebrews, by the way, that the Son humbles himself to the point of death. The Son learns obedience. If this is true, well, this does not sound like something the Son does anyway. This in other words, if it's the case that this Son is just submissive and subordinate within the immanent life of God, and that is actually person defining. It's what defines, in part at least, who the Son is as Son from eternity. Well, all of a sudden, the scandal of the incarnation is no longer that scandalous anymore. They wouldn't like hearing this, but there is a sense in which I think the incarnation, well, that's just a continuation of the subordination and submission that the Son does anyways. That's very different, though, than the language we see in the Pauline epistles and in Hebrews, in which it actually assumes a contrast to say the reason the incarnation is so scandalous, the reason grace is so amazing, is because this is precisely something the Son only does by virtue of his humanity, by virtue of the incarnation. And so this is why I think they can use language to say he learned obedience, and here it's in the context of the incarnation. He humbled himself, that is, to the point of death. This type of language actually says, no, this is something the Son is doing for the purpose of the mission of salvation. This is not something we project into the immanent eternal life of God himself. The irony in this critique is that so many of those who hold to a functional subordination, they like to say again and again, we just believe the Bible, we're just being biblical. But actually, when you look at the context of these texts, it doesn't take much to realize, well, the context of these texts is actually the mission of salvation. The context is not necessarily the immanent life of God, let alone discussions over hierarchy within, the metaphysics of the Trinity. Well, I think it's ironic because in the end, their view is not as biblical as actually it's claiming to be.
Right.
And in the end, it actually undercuts the radical nature of grace that is so crucial then to understand everything from the mission of the Son for salvation to the reception of grace that we receive from him.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's all so key to this argument, and I hadn't really considered that aspect of this before, which is why it really stood out, and it seems like such a straightforward and powerful argument. For all those who are watching and or listening, be sure, if you're interested in this, to pick up the book, again, called Simply Trinity, the Unmanipulated Father, Son, and Spirit. I will say that, it's a pretty ecumenical book. Like this is something that you don't have to be from any particular Christian tradition, I think, to appreciate this. There was a little talk of the covenant of redemption and some Reformed categories at the end, but besides that, it's really very ecumenical, which is great. So I have listeners from all over the theological spectrum. So I think honestly, pretty much anyone can gather quite a bit of great stuff from this book. So thanks so much for taking the time out to be on with me today.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, and so encouraged by everything you're doing.
Well, thanks so much. And thank you everybody who is watching and or listening, and be sure to subscribe on YouTube as well as on your podcast app, and we'll see you next time. God bless.